And just in case you're intrigued, the photo on that screen was taken probably less than 200 metres from here. And I took it about 3 years ago. It's taken in one of the local laneways. In August this year, John Warhurst, in the online current affairs journal Eureka Street, which is published in Australia, proposed that Catholic schools are the jewel in the crown of the Church in Australia. While parishes continue to decline, the school sector is often booming. The contrast between ageing congregations and young students is stark. Equally striking is the contrast between relatively youthful school staff and ageing church leaders. Some school staff see a future in which the school, rather than the parish, was the heart of the church. Now, I'd be very surprised if there aren't some people here who think that it's the welfare services which are the jewel and the crown of the Salvation Army, and that these welfare services are the core of the church, with the worship activities of local cause as peripheral to the overall mission. Indeed, as an outsider from the Salvation Army, my own but probably far from unique experience is that in the wider community there are many people for whom the Salvation Army is nothing more than a welfare agency, albeit one that has a very good reputation and lots of public appeal when it comes to fundraising. Arguably, one of the reasons why its welfare services could be perceived as the Salvation Army's jewel in the crown is that social inclusion is enacted and not just a stated principle. Like Warhurst's reflection of Catholic schools being beacons, likewise, his reflection of Catholic schools being beacons of social inclusion might well apply to many Salvation Army services. And I've reworded just a few little, about three little bits, and I get something that I think might apply to the Salvation Army. Notably, our welfare services are more open and inclusive than our churches are. They are a sign of where the church should be on matters like inclusion, and there is no going back. These welfare services occupy a world in which value statements such as all faiths, genders, sexualities and cultures are respected, accepted and welcome are predominant. Outdated church teaching about sexuality and gender is implicitly and explicitly rejected. Most service users and staff would have it no other way. It's been proposed that welfare services constitute a site where the sacred and the secular interact. But just what distinguishes a so-called faith-based agency from other services is not always readily apparent. In fact, as an outsider, it can be very difficult to distinguish a welfare organisation that is faith-based from one that is not, particularly when policies and principles are articulated in secular rather than theological language. And I must say, in some cases, that's not a bad thing, because theological language can be thoroughly and utterly alienating, as can, I should say, any form of corporate speak that's become a mantra. And I say this as someone who's theologically educated, that I often find theological language over the top. And if you want to put me off, that's the best way to do it. Furthermore, in Australia, there are faith-based agencies which receive government funding on the basis that services are provided on a strictly secular basis. I've talked with people over the years who've told me about some programs that they've been funded in which they are asked to promote the name of the program rather than the auspicing organisation. And that's gone down to including using program rather than agency letterhead, such that the people who use the services may be quite unaware that the service has been contracted out to a local faith-based agency. Somebody I spoke to a few years ago when I was doing some work on interviewing people around working in faith-based agencies said to me, "I suppose that's one of the challenges. And I think the other thing is, I suppose the challenge for faith-based agencies and churches is how do you make that link? How do you make that link between what makes a faith-based agency different from an ordinary agency? What is different about us? And that's quite a challenge in a sense, because we use the same paperwork that everyone else uses. We follow the same processes that other agencies do. So, like others before me today, I have used it to define what I think I'm going to define what I mean by faith-based agency, because there are lots of different definitions. And unlike some who've chosen to use this term solely in respect of organisations which have an overt mission focus, I'm using the term to refer to any social service agency which explicitly identifies with a religious tradition and/or is auspiced by any religious organisation or religious community. Programs or services offered by a faith-based agency don't necessarily have a religious content. So that's my definition that I work from, which may be slightly different to what you use, but that's how I'm coming from things today. Expressions of faith include the branding of an organisation, organisational structure, how an organisation understands its purpose, including the role of religion in service provision. And I want to have a look at those three things now. Start with branding. And I think for better or worse, the Salvation Army does have a distinct visual branding, and that's been very apparent today. Not just locally or nationally, but internationally. The international panel this morning, didn't matter really where they came from in the world, they had pretty much the same clothing, branding. Most people know the Salvation Army, even if they know very little about it. And they may have no idea, they probably know that this is an organisation which provides services to vulnerable members of the community, but they may not know it's a religious organisation. Social worker I worked for the Salvation Army once said to me, I think the Salvation Army specifically has a very, very good reputation in the public in general. And a lot of the money they raise is because of what they've done in the past. So the war, being out there, helping the soldiers, people often talk about that. But it's also, I think, about meeting those people who are most in need. The Salvation Army in general would work with the most disadvantaged, the ones who perhaps have fallen through the system for other reasons. Wide recognition, however, doesn't necessarily equate with a good understanding of the Salvation Army, and in particular it being faith-based. And you've probably also met people who assume that all Salvation Army staff have religious roles, and even those staff who may be employed on a secular basis, they're considered to be religious, even if they're not actually hold any faith, let alone or faith that's consistent with the views of the Salvation Army. That photo on the right was taken just very close to here a few years ago. There was a whole lot of anti-Salvation Army graffiti went up in one of the local laneways. In terms of organisational structures, faith-based agencies vary in requirements regarding reserving specified roles within the organisation, either staff and or board of management members for people of the faith. The assumption of having people of the faith is that it will lead to an ethos that this is faith-based, permeating the life and the work of the organisation. Someone who was on a board of management said to me, we try to do strategic planning because for me that is what faith-based agencies have always been, on the edge for the most disadvantaged, where government services aren't providing support. And I think that's what's occurred over time, is we've often continued with those services beyond when they're on the edge and they've become universal services. But because of the history of service provision, the faith-based agencies continue to be providing those services. One of the concerns, if people are appointed on the basis of their faith, is the question, do they also have the relevant expertise to be running a welfare agency in the 2020s? And I think if you don't have both the faith and the expertise in the running, things can be problematic. It can lead to limited thinking about what the agency could achieve, particularly in things like socially inclusive practice. It's been said to me, I think by someone who was working in the and it might have been someone in the Salvation Army, as you get higher up, there's a number of levels of management, and a lot of those levels are filled by religious officials. Some have had no social work experience or training whatsoever. So when I started with whichever organisation it was with, the person who came in was a senior church official, had come straight from the church ministry, had no idea about welfare organisations. He was a nice person, he did a reasonably good job, but he didn't have that sort of training. So it can be a catch-cry if you don't have the balance right of expertise and faith. This picture on the right here, I was overseas for work at one stage, and I saw that billboard, on a street in a shopping area in Sweden. I thought that was it was religion, a force for peace, and someone holding a gun. Some religious organisations understand their purpose to the wider world to consist of providing a service to disadvantaged members of the community, with little or no expectation of altering the religious beliefs and practices of those to whom they provide services. From the perspective of someone working in a faith-based agency said to me, I think there's quite a positive role to see faith-based agencies playing a part in the delivery of social services. I think there's a strength or a depth to the services. I think in terms of religion, I think like most religions would see the practice of the religion, not simply in terms of going to church and participating in the services, but in living the faith in terms of charitable actions. By way of contrast, however, the hope of religious conversion underpins the service provision of some faith-based organisations in the world. This can lead to the question of whether faith-based agencies are called to be the mouthpiece of God or the quiet voice of God. Or in other words, are they called to preach or be a presence through service provision? How we understand faith-based agencies is critical in addressing the question of what is the role in faith-based agencies in building inclusive communities. So I want to turn now to thinking about building inclusive communities. One of the problems I have with many programs which seek to build inclusive communities is the ways in which their goals are and their evaluations. And they often tend to focus on whether some numeric indicator has improved or not, rather than what it means for the people. For example, in Australia, there's a target to increase the proportion of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people living in an appropriately sized, i.e. not overcrowded, housing to 88% by 2031. In 2016, the figure was 78.9%, and by 2021, the figure had increased to 81.4%. That is a pretty standard way of seeing, in our society, of seeing whether things are becoming more inclusive. However, we need to remember that numbers represent people. So just going somewhere differently, I'm going to go to Pope Benedict, the late Pope Benedict XVI, in his first encyclical Deus Caritas Est. He proposed that faith-based agencies are dealing with human beings, and human beings always need something more than technically proper care. They need humanity. They need heartfelt concern. Those who work for the Church's charitable organisations must be distinguished by the fact that they do not merely meet the needs of the moment, but they dedicate themselves to others, and they've become service to others with heartfelt concern, enabling them to experience the richness of their humanity. So inclusive communities must be about real people who feel welcome. I don't know that any of you ever saw the television interview between Lee Sales and Shane Warne on 7:30 on ABC television a few years ago. Lee Sales began with the words, "Shane, it's lovely to meet you," to which he responded, "It's nice to be met." Often considered a larrikin, Warne was someone who was welcomed for who he was. And it really reminds me of the story of Jesus meeting a Samaritan woman at the well, and he offered her living water. Although she'd had 5 husbands and the man she was living with was not currently her husband. As such, the Samaritan woman responded to Jesus as someone who'd been met, rather than as for who she was, rather than the person society expected her to be. Service users may also have an expectation of faith-based agencies being more responsive to their needs than other organisations, and may even voice this to agency staff. Someone once said to me, a social worker said, "I can certainly say that for some clients who don't get what they want, they're reminded that you're supposed to be God-based and you should do things because God wants you to." I'm not sure what they say to the non-secular, to the non-faith-based ones. Faith-based organisations often have strong community links, and they've often been able to reach parts of the population which might not be able to be reached by other service providers. Sorry, that's the right one. Particularly those marginalised communities which state-run services struggle to connect with. Somebody said to me once, "You know, what we hope to do, what we want to try and do and hold on to is that closeness to our community, and that's social capital, that we all know that is a sort of gold nugget in terms of community development. So the relationships, that's what's really important to us, and I think we have that." Not surprisingly, faith-based agencies often develop reputations as establishing innovative services which governments have not established or seen the need for, or where the design of existing services is unable to address the needs of service users. In one agency, someone said to me, "I think it's because we align ourselves with the gospel. We are called or compelled in a way which to be responsive, but also to be innovative, to be open to possibility." In contrast, many state-provided services are often highly bureaucratic and rule-bound, and there may be little scope for flexibility in approach. And that's, I guess, one of the strengths for faith-based agencies, that ability to be innovative. One of the reasons why many faith-based agencies are able to be flexible is that they can, as was mentioned earlier this afternoon, draw on additional resources to any government funding. And that, as Bronwyn Pike was talking about, both financial and human capital. Hence, although the Salvation Army often attracts funding for its program, it nevertheless contributes its considerable additional resources of its own, including into programs. And that's both financial resources and human resources. But it can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. Due to differing needs, resources and priorities in different communities, effective faith-based agencies need to make decisions or find ways of working which are appropriate in and for the communities in which they work. Furthermore, with decreasing numbers of people attending or even identifying with the church, faith-based agencies which have grown accustomed to additional injections of support from their faith base may find in the future there comes a time when they're no longer able to rely on the levels of support, financial or human capital. One role in which faith-based agencies, I think, have shown model good practice in various parts of the world is in working with people from diverse religious traditions. This involves an openness to dialogue with people from other faiths. Rather than attempting to homogenise different religious traditions, accepting the diversity is an important step to building socially inclusive communities. At the most basic level, this may simply be the ability to enable different communities to meet through the shared use of space. At an organisational level, faith-based agencies can work together to achieve goals that may be more difficult for individual organisations. In bringing together diverse communities, the hope is that each will benefit. It's been suggested that public faith engages with service delivery, with community cohesion and in governance. In each of these arenas, it encounters and is encountered by a whole range of differing values, goals, practices and languages. The challenge is to respond in a context of mutuality, reciprocity and trust if the shared meal at the public table is not to result in indigestion. Finally, faith-based agencies certainly have the potential to contribute to the development of socially inclusive communities, but believing what we are doing is in line with what God wants does not preclude the need for evaluation. Any faith-based approach needs to be analysed and evaluated by those adopting it and by those on the receiving end of services. It may provide exactly what is needed in particular circumstances, either because of or despite its faith characteristics. But at the same time, it may fail to do so for the same reasons. Those reasons may include organisational factors. As such, in order to effectively build socially inclusive communities, faith-based agencies may first need to address important internal and external obstacles in fulfilling any potential that they might have as sources and generators of social capital. They may themselves also be obstacles to the outward-looking and enriching of social networks. What is considered an inclusive community continues to evolve, so there will always be work to do, and hopefully a role for faith-based agencies to be part of this important work. But faith-based agencies cannot take themselves for granted and may face increasing competition from secular services who argue that they can provide an even more inclusive than a faith-based agency which has been identified as an organisation in which is associated with abuse. So thank you, finally. Thank you for your invitation, and I wish you well in what is very challenging work. And it's going to require not only your heart, but also a head.